All right, so we talked about the causes. One of the things too is like make sure that you would be able to have SFI to like think about like how did it progress? Like how did colonists shift from loyal British subjects to this idea of patriotism and independence, okay? And we also talked about the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening that kind of were inspiring those movements. So the Declaration of Independence, right, is going to pull from common sense. And remember, independence was not like when the Constitution, when the colonists start coming together and start trying to think about, you know, what are we going to do about how the British are acting? Independence was not a thought until that summer in 1776. And common sense played a role in that because it got people talking as well. So it's kind of like the press almost influencing Americans to kind of side with that. Remember that it was Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin. Remember also that there was talk of including abolishing slavery. And that was something that Franklin and Adams said, hey, listen, yeah, we agree with you and we think that that's important, but we need Southern delegates to sign off on this. And our goal right now is independence for ourselves, and we'll worry about slavery later. Whoops. That ends up not happening, okay?
But do you think they're right though? Like it probably.
Yeah, no, they wouldn't have had a declaration. Yeah. If the Southern states wouldn't have, no, it was for sure a political move. That was the sacrifice, right? That was the compromise. And compromise is a really important theme in history when you're looking at political actions. Like, so that was a compromise that happened then. If you think about the compromise over slavery, even in the Constitution with the 3/5 compromise, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, like that's just politics. It's always been, even like with the COVID bill, right? You know, was it only for COVID relief? Heck no, they put a bunch of other stuff in it. And that's just the reality of politics, okay? Whether it's right or wrong, okay? So American Revolution. We won, yay, no. Okay, so in spite of the fact that it was a civil war, you could even write that down in an essay somewhere. They would love that. It was a civil war at the same time as being a revolution, right? You had loyalists and patriots. You had neighbors who didn't know how they felt about this war for independence. Remember the military advantages and the financial advantages that the British had over the United States. And really it was only because the French showed up and like we were able to use their Navy. And then also just staying the course. Washington's leadership was also really important because he kept his men motivated and the morale as high as he possibly could, despite the fact that the delegates at the within the constitutional, or not the Constitution, but the delegates in Congress weren't funding the war. Do you remember that? Do you remember the impact that it had on the troops? They didn't have weapons. They didn't have uniforms. Valley Forge, like there was an uphill battle, and they were able to, in the end, draw out the war. Remember that strategy? Let's draw it out. Let's hope that the British give up, and that's eventually what will end up happening. Remember that Saratoga, that's good SFI, is a turning point in the war, that the French said, hey, these guys are legit. Washington's for real. Lafayette is lobbying. And that was the turning point where the French decided to step in. Now, the government that was put in place during the Revolutionary years and the years after was under the Articles of Confederation. Remember, our early history, we were a confederation of states, right? There's no U.S. Constitution. Our Constitution was the Articles of Confederation. And what it did is it created a very weak centralized government. Why would they want to create a weak centralized government? Right. They didn't like the tyrannical British overreach, so they created a government that gave more rights to the states, okay? And remember some of the problems here. They didn't have the ability to tax, which means you can't have a military, you can't fund it. It was very difficult to pass laws. You had to have 9 out of 13 states. Each state had one vote, right, or equal vote. Well, what about really populated states like Virginia? They have the same pull as Connecticut. I mean, come on, right? And so those are some of the problems. One success was the Northwest Ordinance, okay? And that's, we're talking about that territory right there, where it said like how we are going to admit states in the future in that process. And the other thing is that it outlawed slavery in that territory. And everybody was okay with that, right, at that point in time. So that's a big change between when we start admitting states later on, right, when we're moving out into this area and we're starting to admit states, southern states are wanting to make sure that they have kind of a balance of power. That wasn't a big deal at this point in time in history, because why was slavery expanding into the West not as important to southern states in the late 1700s as it was in the early 1800s? How are the economies of the South a little bit different?
Tobacco versus cotton.
Tobacco versus cotton, right? Cotton is not a major cash crop yet. Slavery has not expanded into this dominant, to dominate the economy. I mean, they're using plantation slavery, but it's not like chattel slavery, like breeding and selling and the price of slaves going up. That didn't exist yet. And so the Northwest Ordinance is a good piece of SFI to kind of help remember that things were different before the cotton gin, especially politically when looking at expansion in slave states versus free states, okay? Shays' Rebellion is an example. And again, with like, if we're looking at themes, rebellion and protest, here you have a group of men that are upset about taxes, right? And the fact that we didn't have a centralized government and military to put down that rebellion, this is what got Washington and Hamilton and other Federalists concerned about the future of the country, right? We've worked so hard. We've beaten Britain. We have our independence. We are very, very weak, which means we're susceptible to what? Britain coming in again or some other power. And so after Shays' Rebellion, maybe, there we go. You have the Constitutional Convention. I would know that James Madison is the father of the Constitution. He's the one that authored most of it. And you have federalism, separation of powers. I'm not going to go over all that part because that's a lot of civics, unless anyone has a specific question about something there that that you think, I mean, to me, this is just something that's important to know. I don't think that you're going to have an essay on the, oh God, what if there was like comparing the Articles of Confederation to the US Constitution? I would be able to kind of know the weaknesses and how the Constitution fixed some of those problems. When we're looking at the slave trade, again, that could be, I don't know, last year, one of the DBQ prompts was, like, how did slavery change, or like what was the turning point for slavery? And it was around this time period, kind of what we just talked about. So they wanted you to mention the 3/5 Compromise. They wanted you to mention the Northwest Ordinance. And then they wanted you to talk about Eli Whitney and the cotton gin and that change. Yeah.
What was the Constitutional Convention?
So we're in the late 1780s. So we had 10 years under the Articles of Confederation. So Washington is inaugurated in 1789. The Electoral College votes in the fall of 1788. And so let's see. And one of the issues with the ratification is that a lot of people that are still like anti-federalists at the time, so they believe in a smaller government, they're very concerned over individual rights, right? They're thinking about the things that happened leading up to the American Revolution, and they are concerned about those personal individual rights, like press, like speech, the militia, right? Because when you look at like Lexington and Concord, they went to take those men's weapons. They went to put down the militia, right? Because they saw them as a threat. That is going to lead to why we have a Second Amendment. Search and seizure, quartering of troops, like these things are in our Constitution because at the time, they thought that that was something that needed to be protected. Remember that the Constitution is a living document. It is meant to be amended over the course of time, depending on what the issues are that concern us. And that's important just like as Americans to kind of understand. Yeah.
In the beginning, was the Constitution supposed to be a list of powers that the government does have, not rather than like what it can do?
Yeah, right. Because like Article 1 explains like what the legislative branch can do. Article 2, yeah, and then even when we added the amendments, it says like whatever powers that are like delegated, that doesn't mean that there are other things that they can't do, and it was supposed to be evolving over time because you can't write a picture perfect document that's going to be able to withstand the test of time. And that's why we're considered this grand experiment, because no one had ever done this before. We were the first to have a government that was, because it's very complex when you look at the separation of powers between the federal government and the states, and then between the three branches and checks and balances and all of that. The whole purpose was to say, hey, listen, we don't want a king and a tyrant. We don't want someone taking too much power. And so we're between either governments. And so, because the states can do something wrong, right? They segregated African Americans and whites for 100 years, right? The federal government should have had the power to come in and put that down, but I guess they didn't care. But eventually they do, right? After the Civil Rights Movement, okay? The Whiskey Rebellion, anything between Shays Rebellion and Whiskey Rebellion, they go together perfectly. Shays Rebellion showed the weaknesses of the articles. The Whiskey Rebellion showed the strength of the Constitution. And it's also going to lead to the development of political parties, okay? So looking at the Declaration, the impact of the Declaration. If you're looking for contextualization, it inspired the French Revolution, right? They're going to overthrow their monarchy in that time, which is also inspired by the Enlightenment. It's going to, this is what's really important, to lead to this two-party system, which is going to be, I mean, it's still kind of an issue today in that, that was one of the things that Washington mentions in his farewell address is, hey, listen, remember that we're Americans first. Political parties were not a thing. You had certain factions that existed over certain issues. But the fact that it's like you would belong to one of these two parties was a very new idea, okay? And then also it's going to lead to uprisings, the revolution in Haiti and Latin America. All right, so Washington's farewell address. There's always a question on Washington's farewell address, I'm pretty sure, on the AP exam. 2 warnings. Avoid foreign alliances, and I mean permanent foreign alliances, okay? For political reasons, meaning if Britain and France are fighting a war against each other, don't permanently align yourself with one of them because you're going to create enemies by doing that. And we are too weak of a nation at this point in time to attract enemies. And this is important because what Washington is saying right now in his Declaration of Neutrality, especially with the French Revolution, that is going to be one of the long-term things that's going to lead to the War of 1812. So be able to kind of like connect the dots there, okay? And then the second thing is the political parties, right? We don't need to divide amongst ourselves, okay? If we're looking at women, College Board loves to throw out questions, especially like essay questions or any of the FRQs, looking at women, African Americans or minority groups, any type of like civil rights, looking at women and the continuity throughout history. It starts with Republican motherhood. And I don't know, one of the reviews, one of the writing workshops we maybe talked about the cult of domesticity. I don't remember. It's all blurring together. Republican motherhood goes back even further. Republican motherhood is a political theory. Remember that Abigail Adams kind of like wrote letters to John Adams, her husband, who was at the Constitutional Convention, when they were writing the Articles of Confederation. And she was saying, hey, remember the ladies, like, your fathers and grandfathers have always ignored us in politics, but this is your opportunity to make change. And he basically ignored her. And because how they justified it was, hey, listen, ladies, you do play an important political role. You raise sons in a way where they will grow up and they will vote. And you're doing a good job at it. So keep it up, right? No, raise your sons to be good citizens. raise them to have the values that nurture and support a republic. Now they are going to gain more access to education. They're going to play a role in the war, but again, like over time, after each war, women gain more rights, and you have to know that. It might be education after the Revolutionary War. After the Civil War, it's going to be like certain legal rights. Some states start to give women the right to vote. We talked about divorce, like the right to divorce before, and like certain like inheriting property. That's something else they'll get after the Civil War. After World War I, you got flappers, right? And you get the right to vote. And then after World War II comes the feminist movement. So that's a really good, when looking at continuity and change over time, that war positively affects women over the course of time, okay? Now, Washington leaves. You see how fast we're going through all this. And John Adams becomes president. So this is the Federalist era. John Adams is a Federalist, okay? And one of the early issues that's plaguing his administration is the French Revolution and the fact that we have a lot of immigrants coming into the country, and they are more with the Democratic Republican Party. And again, you had to be there for a while in order to get citizenship and vote, but they are voting, and more people are siding with the Democratic Republicans. And the Federalists don't like that they are criticizing them in that way. And so the Alien and Sedition Acts is passed, and it basically limits freedom of speech. You cannot question the government. You cannot, if you are a foreigner who questions the government, you are kicked out. Xenophobia is a continuity throughout American history. When times get tough and times get turbulent, immigrants are often seen as a scapegoat, and that's something that you could go all the way back to the Alien Seditions for. So because Adams was not very popular, especially after that move, that is going to allow for Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, to win that election. And remember, it was called a revolution because most of the time when there's a dramatic shift in public support for politicians or policy in history, right? That's when governments can be overthrown, right? Adams left the White House. He left peacefully. He moved on. This is the will of the people. And the government transitioned really smoothly. That doesn't always happen in history, right? And so this was a really good sign that maybe we did create a government that is, can be successful, okay? There's a review sheet somewhere on that website, on my Canvas website, where it has political parties, and it looks at every political party, major political party throughout the entire course. That might be something really good to review, because if you understand the Democratic Republic, the central conflict between the major political parties throughout time, it'll really help you build contextualization and kind of if you're given a question, you're like, okay, the Federalists were about the economy and they're mostly in the North. The Democratic Republicans are mostly farmers, expansion. Just being able to have that knowledge or being able to pull that information might help you if you have a question on the Louisiana Purchase. I think that would be helpful. There's also a document on there where I've filled it out, and it has every presidential administration and all the important things that happened during their administration. That's another really good resource to kind of study, around the AP exam. Okay. So, difference between the two parties, and you're starting to see here that there's kind of a regional divide, right? It has more to do with the economy. You vote for a political party because of maybe your occupation. Federalists were typically upper class. They believed in loose interpretation of the Constitution, meaning that it can be broadly interpreted. That's how they got Hamilton's economic plan, right? Jefferson was like, is a Bank of the United States even constitutional? And Hamilton was like, well, it's not constitutional. Yeah, they made that argument. Where Jefferson was much more strict, right? It's no, small government. We need to stay with kind of when thinking of, so even though he supported the Constitution, he still wanted to kind of rein in that power. But let's be honest, after Jefferson's elected, he realizes that Hamilton's economic plan and that big government was needed. Like, he started to realize that in order for them to grow and prosper as a nation, to be able to compete, they're going to need the government to step in. For example, Louisiana. If he had stuck to his strict constructionist views, he would have never purchased Louisiana. But why did he do it? Yeah, it was expansion. He's thinking about this agrarian future. And if you don't have land to expand upon, that's going to be stifled. And so he started to realize that, like, there were certain times where it was okay. Okay, so that's period 3. American Revolution, Constitution, and the Federalist era. Okay, so if any of that was like, holy crap, I have no idea what you're talking about and you talked way too fast, maybe put a star beside it and say, I need to go back and I need to look at a review video focused on Jefferson and Hamilton. And remember that on each of those period reviews on Canvas, it has like 3 different videos that you can watch. We talk about Heimler's history. I like his review videos a lot. You can even just in YouTube say, like, difference between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, APUSH. And there are teachers that have done small, short, little, like 5 to 8 minute videos that are on those topics, okay? So here are a couple different possible LEQs, but I'm gonna keep going so we can get as far into 4 as possible. This is outdated, actually, because I was looking at it yesterday. The College Board updated period 4, I think, is between like 12 and 16% of the exam. They give these ranges now.
Pretty sure on the homepage it says every single like era from period 2 to 8 is 10 to 17.
Say that again, 10 to 17?
For like all of periods like 3 through 8.
Yep, that's probably about right. Normally period 4 is not as heavily, and I think honestly we're due for a DBQ from this time period, to be completely honest. And last year, now that I'm thinking about it, on my list, westward expansion was and how that impacted slavery and political division. That was one of the DBQs last year, and we practiced one right before the AP exam. And my students that got that one scored 4s and 5s. Like, I polled them. I was like, which one did you get? I don't think they're going to do anything on the second grade awakening. They could do something on the reformers. So remember when we were talking about how they have this religious movement, the second grade awakening, and how it inspired the abolition movement and the temperance movement, all of those things. I know that sounds absolutely miserable, but that could be a topic. I really like the idea, though, of democratization, something with Andrew Jackson. We are due for something on him. Every teacher, like, if you don't teach Andrew Jackson and democratization and expansion of voting rights for white men, obviously we're forgetting women and African Americans, obviously, duh. They're women, silly. But I think that Andrew Jackson might be a good one for us to focus on as a possible topic, okay? So 1800 is a turning point because of Jefferson. 1848, I have Seneca Falls, but a better one for this is going to be like the Mexican-American War as a turning point. Focuses, that would be a mean essay prompt too, is the market revolution. Because that's like steamboats and the Erie Canal, like looking at how the economy expanded. That would be like the equivalent of like a mercantilism question, in my opinion, because that a lot of kids find early 19th century macroeconomics to be quite boring. Will would like to write that essay, I'm sure, right, Will?
Oh, I would hate to write. I don't even like 21st century economics.
I like the idea of democratization. I think that that's a long time coming. And again, every teacher really because Jackson's so crazy. I don't know. I think that would be a good one because it's a very important period of time. Okay. All right. Louisiana Purchase. You guys should feel good on that, right? We just talked about that. Supreme Court. John Marshall. We just recently had a chapter check question when looking at the Warren Court about how influential the Warren Court was as a liberal court that gave a lot of individual rights. John Marshall is very important in the same way because how he expanded the role of the federal government over the states. He basically went rogue. Like judicial review, like that is legislating from the bench. The Supreme Court is so influential and has the ability to have a ton of power and has over the course of our history. If you think about legislating from the bench, right? Basically, you get these, depending on what period of time you're in, anywhere from 5 to, at the most, what was the biggest we ever had the court? I think we actually had more than 9 at one point. I don't remember. Anyways, but those people, if you get the right combination of constitutional interpretation, you could do a lot with that because of judicial review. And that's why people care about Trump and Biden's, nominating liberals or conservatives in the Supreme Court, is because you can legislate that way. Okay? All right. I'm going to keep going. I would at least look at a map beforehand, right? So if we're looking at how we're expanding over time between the 13 colonies, after the American Revolution, obviously Louisiana, we're going to annex Texas, which is going to cause us to go to war with Mexico. We're going to get that, and then we're going to negotiate this with Britain. Now, remember that Texas, the Mexican cession, and Oregon is all accomplished in the one presidential term of James K. Polk. Right? Okay. But again, that was one of the DBQs last year, so I might not even spend too much time on that one. So this would be such a mean, boring, horrible essay to write, but you could do it, okay? Causation, it's a really easy one. You had this religious movement, and it's going to cause people to be more, think of their morals a little bit more. It's going to prompt the abolitionist movement. Slavery is a sin. It's going to create this view too of like temperance and education. So we're educating, society now to be more democratic. That kind of goes back with that democratization. Dorothea Dix is helping the mentally ill and in prison and rehabilitation. Just think, what would Jesus do? And how, it's just kind of like Jimmy Carter, if you were here first period. What would Jesus do, right? And that's going to prompt reforms. They're trying to improve society. Notice, though, it's not the government trying to improve society. It's the people, right? And so that's even, especially in the 20th century, the progressive era of the 20th century was the government putting things in place to help the people. In the 19th century, it's the people that are doing that. The churches, the nonprofit groups, those different groups that are doing it. Okay. I just named off a bunch of reforms. Oops. All right. Early market revolution. Okay. How do I explain this in a way that's a little bit easier for cause and effect here? As a result of the War of 1812, okay, remember that during the War of 1812, we weren't able to trade with Britain. And we did a lot of trade with them because they produced the goods in their factories. They had that infrastructure established. We did not because of the Navigation Acts, okay? And so we kind of depended on their industry. Between the Embargo Act of 1807, between the War of 1812, we had to become more self-sufficient. I think we wrote this essay. Didn't we? I think we did like our first LEQ maybe related to this topic, where the effects of the War of 1812. Y'all are like, whatever, Miss Cruz, shut up. We don't remember that. I think this is the first essay we wrote where we looked at the effects of the War of 1812 and we did it together. But it economically sent us into this early market revolution where we are, we're doing patents, we're encouraging entrepreneurship, the tariffs are high, steamboat technology, we're digging canals, we're promoting commerce and trade, okay? All of that is happening this is around the 1820s to the 1840s. How does trade impact movement and migration? Migration is a theme. So get to use my map again. Y'all are you're actually here for me to use my map. So if we're doing canals, right, that connect this, oh wait, actually maybe I should go through the Great Lakes, right? What's happening here? Yeah, people are moving into this region. If you can transport goods better, right? These people now have access to markets all up and down the eastern seaboard and overseas. And so what happens is people that are looking for economic opportunity, they're moving into this region because you can be a farmer now and grow corn or wheat in Illinois, put your stuff on a steamboat in Chicago or a canal that connects to Chicago on the Great Lakes, and you can now sell it. Plus, you're not isolated to where you're having to be like self-sufficient and like, weave your own like clothing. You can buy ready-made fabric that's made in Connecticut or in Massachusetts, and it can be put on a ship and it can get to you to where you can buy it, right? So because you now have the opportunity to like stay connected and to make a living because of transportation, that's really important. That transportation promotes expansion. And if you are promoting expansion, right, it's going to start leading to political problems, right, as you're applying for statehood and things like that. All right.
When you write you asked about that, is that like legit, like actual buses? It's not.
Sorry, the Bank of the United States.
Okay.
Sorry, bus is the Bank of the United States. Excellent question. The American system is much like how Hamilton's financial plan was, except in different time periods. This time period, one of the things that is a continuity, right, or that you're going to see consistently is high tariffs. It's really only until after World War II where we start to lower tariffs for like global trade because we depend on it. But our strategy at this point in time in history, for the Whigs are about to show up. We're going to talk about the Whig Party and the Federalists before that, is if you raise tariffs, you have to understand this. 100% there will be either multiple choice question or something where tariffs will come into play. Tariffs were supported by business people, industrialists. Back at this point in time, anyone that had anything to do with trade and commerce. They liked tariffs because it promoted American businesses, right? It made the British fabric more expensive than the American fabric. So you're going to buy the American fabric. Who didn't like tariffs? So if commerce, trade, big business people like tariffs, who didn't like tariffs?
Wasn't it like Southerners and Democrats?
Southerners and farmers and Westerners, people that they didn't see the kickback in industry, right? Because they don't work in a factory, right? Or, in a textile mill. They run their own farm. So the only thing, how it affects them is they have to pay more for these goods, right? They're paying more for the steel plow or the mechanical reaper or the fabric, okay? And so rural people, Southerners, did not like tariffs. I cannot believe how fast that went. Holy cow. I think that this might be possible DBQ navigation area. It was when we're looking at democratization, universal white male suffrage. Another effect of that early market revolution, this transportation revolution. So economically, you have an effect. Political effect is people that were poor and locked out of being able to vote in Pennsylvania, or that's not a good example, in North Carolina, are now picking up and moving into Tennessee. and Kentucky and Missouri, right? They're moving out here and they get to make the laws. They get to write their own constitution. And one of the things that they leave out of those constitutions is property qualifications for white men to vote. That's as far as I got. You see how long this is going to take. And so I'll start with that, I guess. The next one. Thanks for tuning in, guys.